good morning, everyone. As my grandmother used to say, I'm glad to see everybody bright-eyed and bushy-tailed this morning. I think you're going to be in for a real treat. This is going to be a retrospective view of ARPA-E over the last 10 years. And I think this is the first time that we've had all four of the either directors or acting directors together on the stage at the same time. So this will be an interesting conversation. We want you to pitch in toward the end. My name is Bart Gordon. In 1984, when Al Gore ran for the United States Senate, I succeeded him in the House. And then in 2011, I retired, fortunately undefeated and unindicted. And so I am now a partner at K&L Gates. But during that time, among other things, I was chairman of the Science and Technology Committee and a senior member of the Energy and Commerce Committee. And in 2006, early 2006, I asked the National Academies to do a report on competitiveness in America in the 21st century and make some recommendations. They pulled together a very distinguished group and came forth with something called the Rising Above the Gathering Storm report. And quite frankly, a lot of it was some of the usual suspects of what we needed to do, education, investment, those sort of things. But there was one new idea, and that new idea was that for the United States to prosper and lead in the 21st century and be secure, that there should be an agency within the Department of Energy that was a high-risk, high-reward agency and modeled after DARPA, and that's how ARPA-E was developed. So I took those different suggestions, put them together in something called the American Competes Act. We passed that legislation. President Bush signed it. And I remember, I think I told you, Arun, when we went to the White House for that signing, President Bush said, well, I like this bill except for that ARPA thing. So that ARPA thing didn't get much love right there at first. Then along comes President Obama. He selects Steve Chu to be the Secretary of Energy. Fortunately, Steve was on that original commission, the Rising Above the Gathering Storm, so Steve was very much in favor of ARPA-E, was a great champion there. And when he came to see me the first time, I told him that I felt there's going to be more good ideas that will be brought in than there'll be money for. And so they need to have some type of a fair to help, show the private sector the ideas that have come in that you funded and some that you haven't funded but you think will be a good idea. And I said, your lawyers will give you 100 reasons why you shouldn't do that. And I said, well, then ask them to give you one why you should. And in typical ARPA-E form, with just in a few weeks, the first summit came about, amazingly. And so here we are today, 10 years later. So we have our acting directors, all very distinguished in their own right. There is a background in the or bio in your information you have, so we could take the whole hour just going over their accomplishments. I'm just going to tell you where they are now, and then we'll get into our program. First is Dr. Arun Majumdar. Arun was the first director, and he is now the J. Precourt chair and professor at Stanford University. Eric Toone is the executive managing director of Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which is Bill Gates' big energy fund now. Cheryl Martin is the founder of Harwich Partners, and Dr. Cheryl Martin, Dr. Eric Toone, and Dr. Ellen Williams is a distinguished university professor at the University of Maryland. Okay, so Arun, we're going back 10 years ago. You walk in the door, there's not much there, some paper, some pencils.
This guy was there.
Yeah. So what were your expectations 10 years later? What would you like to have accomplished, and where are things now, and what do you see happening over the next 10 years?
Well, first of all, let me just make a statement. There would be no ARPA-E without this gentleman out here, Bart Gordon. So let's give him a big round of applause. And indeed, the ARPA-E Summit was your idea, and it took Sunjai Wagle. I don't know if he's here in the crowd.
Yeah.
And we assigned him to put this whole thing together in a couple of months, and literally with the winter break in between, it turned out to be a few weeks. But at that time, so it's, we are directors, et cetera, but you were the father, we are the babysitters. This kid is 10 years old and is looking good. Let's put it this way. But when we came in, Dave Danielson was ARPA-E #1 employee. Eric and Mark Hartney were there. Shane Kozinski, and is Norm Kaufman still around? Okay. He was basically, we used to call him the director because he was doing everything. But from those days, they handled the first open solicitation, which turned out to be a huge hit because all the ideas poured out from around the country, which we had no idea how much capacity to innovate was going around, and that gave us a landscape of what's there. And then we were able to recruit some really talented people like Rajiv Ram, Ravi Prasher, Mark Johnson, and several others later on. And that's how it started. But early days, going back when I joined, and they had already gone through, I think the lights were off, there was no food, and you guys had to eat some pizza, whatever, and they succeeded. And I think that kind of spirit of coming together, doing something, there was a sense at that time that this is new, this is exciting, there's a sense of mission, there's a sense of purpose, and it was not just within ARPA-E, but within the community as a whole. And I think that was just a magical time looking back. And we realized that, if we did this right, 10 years from then, we'll be looking back and say that was perhaps the most exciting time of our careers. And I think when we look back now, it's fair to say it is so. But it is also the careers of the people who we funded, and their research direction, kind of went through an inflection point. And we, as you had suggested, we brought in and showcased the people we could not fund. And I think you and Steve Israel had suggested that. And that turned out to be one of the best things that we did, that we wanted to create this ecosystem. So I can go on, but I think that was a magical time. And I think, as Eric likes to put it, it's lightning in a bottle. And that's really what it was like.
Yeah. And so where did you think you'd be in 10 years? And are you, ARPA-E, and is it there, or is it further? Where?
Well, I think from at least my vantage point, I was at the ARPA-E hearing, talking to members of Congress and other stakeholders. I would say the question of whether ARPA-E should exist or not exist, that question has been answered. I don't think people are questioning that right now, but frankly, we have to be vigilant about that. I think there's tremendous value that it's creating in the ecosystem and for the United States and competitiveness and on the research that it's funding. So I think we have to be vigilant, but the most important thing is to be able to recruit the right people within ARPA-E and give them the autonomy, some level of autonomy with accountability on creating new things. Yeah. And that is probably one of the most important things. At the end of the day, ARPA-E is about the people that it recruits, the talent that it recruits, the model that it has that they have to leave. So there's a sense of urgency, and the culture that you're allowed to, it's program director driven, and they are allowed to come in for a short amount of time and do something different and new with dollars behind it. And for them to then manage all this program, they're basically starting their own field of research. Yeah. And so I think if ARPA-E does that well, the future is very bright. The challenges are enormous. If you look at climate change and the energy issues globally, we are, fair to say, we are at an inflection point of a once-in-a-century tectonic shift in the energy industry. And so, in terms of opportunities to do things new, there are tremendous opportunities. But it's the people, the culture, the resources, the support, and the congressional support, and the White House support. All of that has to happen.
Yeah. It really is a special place just to be around and see the energy and the camaraderie. In the legislation, we put a 2-year limit on how long a program director could be there. You could get, if there was something going on, you could get a year extension. And the reason was to have this sense of urgency, you know, you were in trouble if you went over to ARPA-E and said, well, this is the way we normally do things. I mean, they would throw stuff at you, you know. I mean, they wanted just to do things differently. They wanted to be out there. So, Eric, you were there early. You came out of an academic environment where you had over 100 inventions of your own. You were bringing, from early development to the next stage. Then you got to ARPA-E, gave you maybe one more stage. You know, the 21st century university and how you're bringing out this technology and how you're taking it to the next stage, how is that going to be different than what you started with?
Sure. I think, the university, which is the sort of cradle or where many of these ideas are born, is really changing. It, too, is a living organism. And I think that the university is also undergoing a tectonic shift today. If you look at the 20th century university, was very much a reductionist era of science. It was organized around disciplines, and it was all about building a very fundamental set of knowledge. That's an activity that can obviously go on forever. But at some point, you get to the stage where you understand things well enough that you're able to put that knowledge to work, to start to do things. And I think it's always important to remember that the people that ultimately pay the bills for all of this are the taxpayers of the United States, right? It's plumbers in Iowa, and it's important to make clear to them the value proposition that we represent. So I think that the 21st century university can be most effective by integrating that knowledge that came from that 20th century university and building organizations around problems rather than around disciplines, and putting that knowledge to work to providing real solutions to the greatest problems, the greatest challenges of our time. And unquestionably, at least one of, if not the greatest challenge of our time, is how to sustainably power the planet. And not just for the people who already enjoy the prosperity and access to energy that we have today, but for the 80% of the non-OECD world that, aspire to have the same quality of life that we have today.
And so, Cheryl, you come with a little different background. You were in the private equity area. You were going out trying to find what you think would be winners, helping to grow them and commercialize them. And you really came in more as the commercialization director and then became the acting director. So you had a little more of a mature, I mean, it was beyond the infancy, but still you had to sort of shove them out the door. So
Cheryl is absolutely more mature than I. Everybody in this room knows that.
So what were the commercial innovations you brought in, and what were the lessons learned there for future commercialization? Because you can't get it all on the shelf, but if we don't get some things on the shelf, then we don't have the record to go to Congress and say we need more money.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we weren't going to be able to say to Congress, well, 15 years from now, this will be awesome, so trust us, right? That wasn't going to work. And so we had a really intense conversation right as I was getting there, like, well, what are our metrics? We've been here, we've got this open, solicitation group is getting to the point they're starting to wrap their projects. What are we going to use as metrics? So I think thinking about metrics and the idea that if we just measure patents or publications, then we haven't really addressed our mission. And so we sat down and thought about, if the long game is big impact in the world, the short game is going to be handoff to some other next step. And that's how we came up with these buckets of follow-on funding, funded by another government agency, under solicitation, actually being bought, an M&A picture, forming a company. Because there's no chance of getting to the finish line if you don't get around the first bend, right? And so we looked at those metrics, and I think you've seen tremendous traction in the most recent report, right? For $2.9 billion in follow-on funding, right? 76 companies formed, all these different, follow-on events taking place. So that was super important as we came in and thought about what are we targeting as the agency beyond the technology delivery, which was, it was really, I think, an important discussion, and I think one that led to the favor across the aisle in Congress, that we went in and said, hey, we're going to slowly fill these buckets, watch this. And we delivered, and we kept reporting on the same metrics, right? There's nothing like, changing to make people question what you're up to. But then I think we also had some other pieces at that time. We were going through the first round of program directors were starting to roll off. We were going to have, bringing in new people, starting to figure out as we were growing the agency, how are we going to do that? How are you going to bring in tech to market, new program directors, and continue? Do you continue on with old programs, with follow-on programs? Was this a been there, done that? We should never touch that area again. We had a lot of philosophical conversations that ended up in really specific action while we were there. Even thinking about the SBIR program, right? Looking at what are some of the fundamental barriers, going phase 1 and applying to phase 2. And that 8-month lag for commercial organizations could kill you if you don't have the ability to do that. And so the fact that we went ahead and changed to an automatic phase 1 to phase 2 by passing a go, no-go, and actually being willing to be one of the first places where we were willing to fund companies that even had some level of venture funding. Because we're like, there's places where people's path to market is long, and Congress has said we can do this, and so we should be able to take advantage of everything that we can as an agency to ensure the success of those that we're working with. So I was super proud of the way that the tech to market team started to form and grow and work with the program directors, because it wasn't always easy, right? Not everybody's familiar with these two worlds often operate separately, and I think we kind of take it for granted today that of course you're going to have a conversation about what next, right? The month 37 conversation, right? What happens at month 37 before we give you that check that wasn't how we treated grants before.
Absolutely.
And so I really think that for all of us, it was both internally and externally with our community, a time of thinking about what's it gonna take for us to be able to be successful in getting these things to impact in the market. And I think it's still an ongoing part of the conversation based on where the agency is today. But I'm super excited at 10 years to see what the metrics are telling us about the traction. And we're still younger than DARPA. The percentage gap closes the older we all get. But at 10 years, it's really exciting to see the level of traction and acceptance for the type of agency that ARPA-E is.
Well, Cheryl, you brought up sort of the track record, so let me quickly go over that. ARPA-E has provided $2 billion in R&D funding to more than 800 projects over this last 10 years. 145 ARPA-E projects have attracted more than $2.9 billion in private sector funding, follow-on funding. 76 new companies have been formed. 131 ARPA-E projects have partnered with other government agencies for further development. 2,489 peer-reviewed journal articles have been produced, and 346 patents have come out of ARPA-E. Pretty good record for those 10 years. So, Ellen, we went from a child to a juvenile, and now you sort of inherited an adolescent.
Yeah.
And so moving that adolescent
Awesome.
to a more mature area, where does it need to go, and how does ARPA-E do that?
Yeah. Well, Bart, it was amazingly exciting coming into ARPA-E. The metrics that Cheryl has talked about, the vision and the urgency that we've heard the other program directors are so apparent when you move into that agency. And you're right, I kind of moved in at a point where the vision and the planning and the exploration that had gone before were coming together, and we could really see that the impacts are happening, that it's making a difference, and that it can make a difference on a time scale that's important. But the agency was a little bit at the stage of a gangly but incredibly promising teenager ready to blossom out. We did a lot of strategic planning in those days. One of the things that ARPA-E has done a lot of is to push the envelope beyond the roadmaps of what your normal climate, energy policy type ideas have been. One of the programs that is really exciting that ARPA-E pushed that was quite innovative was the Roots program. The idea that we could take the entire world's soil system and use it as an accelerated carbon sink, allowing us to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere and get a huge additionality to the mitigation efforts that we were getting by decarbonizing the power system and decarbonizing the transportation system. That innovative idea starting in ARPA-E, I'm now seeing gaining traction in the outside world. people, policymakers, modelers are really thinking about this as an important component of what's to come. In the future, ARPA-E needs to continue to push those innovative off-roadmap ideas and bring new concepts into the system. But in addition to that, and I think we've heard it all the way through, it's incredibly important that the successful projects coming out of ARPA-E are able to grow, thrive, and scale up to a meaningful scale on a meaningful time scale. That has been a really hard problem that we all saw. We saw incredibly useful, exciting projects coming out of ARPA-E with great potential. They reached month 37, and they looked out there, and the world was a struggle. The valley of death is a real, crucial issue. And so part of the strategic planning for ARPA-E's growth has been, how do we deal with that? How do we take the most promising projects, the ones that have real potential for impact, and continuing in its innovation mission, help them address the innovative issues of demonstration and scale up that's going to allow them to grow more quickly and attract exterior funding more quickly. And I'm really excited to see that in the last few years, ARPA-E has been doing that. The commercialization team is working even better with the program directors. They've developed great ways of assessing where there's opportunities to push a new company further and faster. They've got an RFI out on the street to look at issues of how do you think about designing programs to set up a pre-pilot program that allows a promising technology to solve some of those innovation issues in really making the technology commercially viable, and maybe a pilot program to solve the scaling issues. So that's what ARPA-E needs to do in the future, is make sure that we stay off roadmap, consider new things, and really drive the impacts coming out of ARPA-E so that we see those benefits moving into the energy system as quickly as possible.
Well, last night I ran into Dave Danielson, and he with Margaret and the two kids, and I asked him what he was doing. And Dave was the first hiree at the ARPA-E, and he's now working with Eric. And he said, his job now is to try to see what are those technologies that are going to be successful over the next 5 or 6 years, so that he can jump over that and start investing in the ones after that.
Yeah.
And so this is what I want to ask. This is a group conversation. And I know, Arun, you had mentioned about how the moonshot had taken solar so much further than you thought it would be.
The sunshot.
Sunshot, excuse me, at this point. So what are those technologies that are going to continue to bloom and do well over the next 5 or 6 years? And then what do we need to be ready to plug into after that so they can take the next step?
Can I just digress a little bit,
Sure.
since you mentioned Dave Danielson? I got to say,
Nothing bad. Don't say anything bad.
Dave was, he was a cultural icon in ARPA-E because he kind of, his style of doing things was so interesting, so nice in many ways, because, when you're starting something new within the Department of Energy, and there are other parts of DOE that are doing similar things, there's always a tension. And he was one of the guys who actually brought down the tension within the DOE,
right.
what we call in-reach, as opposed to outreach, in-reach. And one of the things that Dave started was this Friday evening happy hour.
Yeah.
And that was LaFont Plaza Hotel was still there at that time. And there was this really expensive bar. And he started that. And we all used to go there as on Friday evening and drink, and then suddenly realize staffers from the Hill would come, people from OMB, people from Pentagon, they would all come there to have a good time. And I think that was one of the most important things, to create an environment of, yes, we are all about, excellence, but on a Friday evening, let's just get together. And Dave, to his credit, was one of those guys who actually brought in that culture. Now let's shift to technology. So when we started Sunshot was obviously, the goal was to reduce the cost of electricity to 5 cents a kilowatt hour, solar electricity, 5 cents a kilowatt hour, without subsidies by the end of the decade, in 2010, right? It's very similar to Moonshot in that sense. And at that time, when we had that first workshop, people from the industry came and asked us, what the heck are you guys smoking? Because they didn't realize that it's going to happen. And now we're sitting 10 years later, 9 years later, and it's already happened.
Yeah.
And I think it was very hard to predict. We knew it was going to go down. We didn't know, no one knew how fast it's going to happen. And now we're looking at renewable electricity, at both wind and solar, as the cheapest way to produce electricity, generate electricity. We did not anticipate how fast the cost of lithium-ion batteries are going to come down in 2009. And now it is at the point that within the next 5 years, it'll have range and cost parity with gasoline cars. And so these are things we did not quite anticipate. Now that we're sitting out here, the world is different. And I think we are entering a world of carbon-free electricity at scale that is ultra cheap. And I think we have to think about what are the ways we could utilize that in ways that we have not done in the past because we were not in that world. For example, if you want to take electricity today from a thermal power plant and want to convert to heat, that's a terrible idea, right? However, the electricity that's generated by solar or wind, if you want to convert to electricity to heat, that's perfectly fine because it never started from heat in the first place. So there are other opportunities that show up that are important, and I think we have to kind of be creative, and ARPA-E has to be creative in trying to look for those kinds of opportunities as well.
Yeah.
Cheryl, or you want to add to that?
That's one of the key things about ARPA-E is the ability to have people at the agency with very different views, very different programs, having conversations and interacting all the time. Because those things inherently compete with each other. They reset what the baselines are. They remind each other, sometimes in a day-to-day conversation, sometimes during pitch sessions, oh, that metric's wrong. You know, I think that interaction can't be discounted as we go forward, because I think the idea that you're going to be able to see what the system of the future, what its challenges are, will be first evident in some of those conversations where there's pinch points between people, or somebody challenges, can we do that or not? And then we start to talk about it, put out a FOA in those areas.
Yeah.
I do think, though, you know, some of the issues around how do you continue to roll out and reset your old metrics. Like, we did a lot of like battery innovation with certain cost points that we needed to hit. And so while you're live, how do you continue to move your own metric? And so I think that that's going to be an interesting challenge for the agency as you have more history to say, well, wait a minute, what did we have, and is that still valid? Should we continue to fund it? Do we need to reset our own metric? Or things that we tossed over because they weren't valid before, how do we bring them around again? And I know at the time, you know, what the world thinks is possible. I remember being at the Genie kickoff, and it was like my first day at the agency, and I'm in the hallway around one of those tables with the food, and there's all these people I don't know, and there's these two men at the end of the table talking, and they're like, yeah, you know, we're at this thing, but they'll never be able to control the grid the way they say they will. And I thought, well, crap, I just joined an agency where the people who come to your meetings don't even believe that this is possible. This is a really bad thing. But here we are like, you know, 7, 8 years later, where of course we can control the grid. Of course we can actually manage well beyond what we thought was possible, adding renewables to that grid. And so I do think it's going to be up to ARPA-E to also overcome its own history and what it feels successful for, to reset new metrics.
Absolutely, and that's one of the hardest things there is to do in the whole energy game is, you know, we do energy at scales that dwarf any other human activity, agriculture, anything. And that has profound implications for how long impactful deployment takes. And so this is the ultimate, you know, skate to where the puck is going to be, not to where the skate to where the puck is game. And how do you look 10 years out, 15 years out, and try to build a set of technologies that matches that future?
Yeah.
So
That's a
job.
Canadian coming out of Eric, the puck and all that. Canadian part of the
So little Canada.
Well,
little
before
Canada.
Ellen weighs in on that, we are taking questions from the audience, and maybe the voice of God might need to tell them how to do that. Someone want to?
It's on the screen.
Yeah.
Is it, okay, everybody knows that? Okay, so Ellen, why don't you weigh in, and then we'll take our first question from the audience.
Okay, so I'd just like to add to what everybody's been saying about skating ahead of the puck. And one of the areas that I think is really important for ARPA-E to be looking at in the near future, which is incredibly hard to decarbonize, is industrial emissions and energy use. This is an area that has been neglected in planning and policy, basically because it's so hard. It's easy to see the power sector. Let's decarbonize the power sector. It's easy to think about the transportation sector and say we need to decarbonize the transportation sector. The industry sector is a whole conglomerate of a million different things, all of which are contributing massive amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. And so that area is one where there's a huge opportunity to bring both new technologies and kind of new methods. We haven't talked a lot about systems and the importance of looking at energy systems, bringing in new techniques of data analytics, machine learning, and distributed sensors. All of these things are in the future going to give us vast opportunities to change the way we look at our energy use, change the way that we address it, and help us bring down our emissions. So there's lots of things that we can do to skate ahead of the puck here.
Yeah. When I think another one that's huge, and certainly I was in Europe last week during the huge heat wave that hit Europe.
Yeah.
And that's just a place where they've not had a legacy of having to have air conditioning, and people are suffering. They were stopping school events and all kinds of things, right, when they were getting up towards 100 in some of those spaces. And I think, you know, we've tackled some ARPA-E areas around efficient cooling and things like that, but the whole question, if you've got built infrastructure without air conditioning in it and rethinking it systemically, what can you do? We have to grapple with cooling of people and things in light of an ever hotter world. And what does that mean? And I think I frame it that broadly because I think it needs to be to start with. And then it's the job as we start to think about what pieces of it do you bite off in what direction to go after. But certainly was very striking to me last week when you look at the impediment to just daily life as well as the economy when you have these things going on, right? The French-Swiss rail system actually buckled in the tracks. They were slowing people down on the Autobahn. They were curtailing speed because they were worried about the quality of the road system in those intense heats, right? And that's just a place, those are places we don't think about traditionally, heat having big impact. And it just gets worse as we literally radiate out from there.
Well, we have some really good questions here, so I'm going to try to get through those, and maybe we'll be crisp as we go through it here.
Maybe.
Innovative organizations learn from their mistakes. What are some of yours, and what did you learn? Of course, Eric didn't make any mistakes. So
Yeah, he didn't make mistakes.
Don't hire Canadians.
Actually, I think one thing that we did, and we probably need to do more of it, when we know that applications for grant making are non-trivial.
Yeah.
And when I was acting, we had an offsite where one of the things we went after was the graph of what we should stop doing. And I think that every agency, every entity, heck, I should probably do it at home, what are the things that you're doing that are impactful and not efficient? And if you put it on a matrix of difficulty to implement and impact on the organization and agree that you're going to stop doing the things that you can quickly go after and contemplate the most high impact ones that are hard, I think you stay healthy as an agency. But one of the ones that came up in that conversation was about revisiting our application. And we actually had the legal team go back and revisit this. And what you start to uncover, even in an agency that at the time was only 5 or 6 years old, is that there's things that you had to do based on some issue you had when you were in startup phase. Like we had clauses or things you had to sign off or different things. But when we go back and look at it, now we have like 4 or 5 layers of the same thing. And so we stripped them back out. And all of you people who filled them out probably are like, you didn't go far enough. But you know, there's no free money, so you know, there's a penalty there. But I do think that learning of how you, even a young, agile, innovative agency can walk into some bureaucracy was something that we were so busy kind of pushing it forward, we didn't really see it. And we actually had to ask the community how to do that.
Eric, here's a question for you. At Breakthrough Energy, how do you look at technology differently than when you were at ARPA-E?
That's a great question. And so here I think what you're talking about is how do you traverse this incredibly long and difficult period from idea to impactful deployment. And that's a continuum, and it requires a continuum of funding sources that have different sorts of tolerances for risk. I think ARPA-E was prepared to go considerably beyond what other federal agencies will do in moving technologies towards market. As you do that, of course, you start to run into problems with Congress, right? Picking winners and losers and those kinds of things. I think that is a fallacy. That gap is very large and very long, and it's much larger and much longer today than it has been in the past. In the past, we lived in an era when corporations were willing to spend long periods of time and large amounts of money on R&D. Today, corporations are focused 100% on quarter-over-quarter profits, and 2 years is forever. I think that one of the important reasons that Breakthrough Energy Ventures was created was to be another sort of stop along that continuum, right? That very large gap. I often tell people that I see Breakthrough as sort of halfway in between ARPA-E and Kleiner Perkins, right? We will certainly go earlier, I think, than a lot of other more traditional venture sources will do. Now, having said that, we're not going to take as much risk, technical risk, as ARPA-E was prepared to do. We're a venture fund, right? We need to make money. And, everybody knows who my LPs are, and you can probably say, well, your LPs don't really care whether you make money or not. But I think that it's important for us to make money because that's how you're going to attract more money to this space, right? That's how you're going to attract the pension funds and the sovereign wealth funds and the really big dollars that are going to be necessary to get this done. So making money is...
Losing money is not going to attract more money.
That's right. Losing money is not going to attract more money. That's very true. So I think that when we're at Breakthrough, we do have to look at this and say, do we believe that this is someday going to make to market? If we model this out, is there an exit that gives us a venture-like return, right? Is this a venture investment? So you look at it through a very different lens than you would look at a project through ARPA-E.
Yeah, that was one of the real criticisms that you get from Congress, is you're picking winners and losers, and they don't realize that you don't know the winners and losers at that early on. One way Arun, I think, did a good job as an antidote, and it's a little bit strong to say he would brag about it, but once you invested in something and it didn't work, he didn't try to hide it. He said, this one didn't work, we're going to pull the plug, go on to the next one. Yeah. And I think that was appreciated.
In fact, if we weren't killing things, we weren't taking enough risk.
Actually, that's going back to your previous question, that's one of the things that we had to learn.
Yeah. Exactly.
How to terminate a project.
Yeah.
Because this is, having been on the other side, having received federal fund, if an agency comes and just cuts it off, there are students involved, et cetera. So we actually created a process. We learned from some of the things we did. We created a process in a kind of humane way so that, we're not leaving someone
to wind things.
To give the students.
To give
it is a difficult piece of what's the difference between hopeful and hopeless, right? And we probably didn't kill enough things, and we probably didn't kill them enough faster.
Yeah. But the idea was that the person may have had did not work out, but the person is fine, and we would encourage them to come back to ARPA-E and maybe pivot to other things.
Yeah, and I think it's also really important. We always kind of face the issue of people say, oh, you had these failures. Yeah. And I never felt that a canceled project was a failure. We learned a lot from every canceled project. Those people were willing to take a risk. They put their time and energy into it, and what came out of it was learning, and it really helps. So I really hated that failure word, and we tried to eradicate it.
We lived with, at the time of all the controversy about the loan program and failure, and which again is a whole separate discussion, which we won't go there. But I do think this idea that failure is only if you know something and you keep doing it anyway.
That's failure.
And I really think that we did try hard to take the learning and jump on, right? And so,
Ellen, I have a hard question for you. So what, from them, for you, what do you see as the most successful project coming out of ARPA-E or currently in the works that will come out of ARPA-E?
Oh, boy.
I know you love all your children, so that's
I
what.
love all my
Which
children.
one of your children do you love most, right?
Well, it's also a little bit of which one of my children am I most immediately prepared to talk about. So I would say that one that I really like is the Monolith project. And this was a really amazing project. The field of power electronics is one that underpins a huge breadth of things that go on in the energy world. It's a quiet background that enables new technologies and integration of renewables that improves efficiency. It never appears at the top surface. You're never going to, see a device that says power electronics from ARPA-E on the outside label. Nevertheless, it's really important. The Monolith team addressed a problem, which is to do power electronics, you need to use special materials called wide bandgap semiconductors. And they're notoriously difficult to work with, notoriously difficult to make into devices. The Monolith team approached this in a completely new way. They said, instead of trying to design new expensive ways of fabricating this silicon carbide, let's look at what the semiconductor industry already does with silicon. Let's go to some of these small fabs that have gone out of business or are going out of business because the scale of fabrication has gone down, and work with them and see how we can slightly modify their approaches to do our production of power electronics, silicon carbide devices more cheaply, faster, and better. And they made it work. They drove down the cost of producing these devices. They demonstrated it, and they got bought by a big electronics distributor, Littelfuse. And so out there right now, working its way into the supply chain of the entire energy system is the output of Monolith and the ARPA-E project. So it's a little bit of an invisible story, but it's one that I really love.
Another question, if you were back in the director role, what technologies areas would you have ARPA-E invest in?
I would go back as a program director right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, that's the best
right.
job.
That's the best
it's
job,
not the
right?
director's
Yep,
job,
that's
by the
right.
way.
So I would follow up on Ellen's comment about industrial processes. I mean, I think that's one of the hardest areas that there is to decarbonize. It's an area that there has been very little innovation applied to, and it also builds. Arun mentioned as you have these advances, say in solar, right? All of a sudden you have super cheap carbon-free electricity to kind of pull a lens back and say, all right, well, what does that enable? What can we do, right? Can we do electrochemical production of steel, right? Steel's 3% of global emissions. But these are really difficult challenges. Concrete's 8 or more % of global emissions, and 70% of the built environment in 2050 probably doesn't exist today. If we build it with steel and concrete the way that we've built infrastructure today, we're screwed no matter what else happens, right? So I think some of those industrial processes, I would really echo.
I would actually go for, and this is not my field, but I would like learn about this, is the urgency of the CO2 problem is so big right now that going back to the Roots program, I would look at something similar to figure out how to enhance photosynthesis, to reduce the carbon in the atmosphere and do something with it, right? And I don't know exactly what it is. It may be not Roots, but something like that, because if you don't do that, if you don't have negative emissions,
Right.
I mean, 2 degrees, I think we're already baked in. We're looking at 3.5, 4 degrees. And the extremes of those temperatures are so bad that we have to do something. And I think the negative emissions part has to be raised. The profile has to be raised. And that's something that I would be very interested in.
I'll put another one on the table, which is just kind of emerging in popular awareness, which is super strong wood. And the idea that we can possibly replace a lot of traditional building materials like steel and concrete
engineered wood
with engineered wood, which has the incredible benefit of it's actually a carbon capture and storage mechanism by itself. So in addition to reducing the emissions from carbon and steel, you're actually sucking carbon out of the atmosphere as you build your buildings.
I think there's a growing understanding of the climate disaster that is before us and the challenge that we have. And I would suggest if someone is making a pitch that the twofer, I think, is going to be both the alternative energy, but also how that helps you in terms of the climate. And with limited dollars,
Yeah.
those projects are the ones that are framed that way are going to be the most likely to get funded. So I guess with that, you know, the question that I receive most is obviously funding. I've got this great idea. How can I get the funding? So Eric, you're somewhat in the center of all of this. You've got, you know, your venture fund. You know, Ernie Moniz has his international fund. You know, there's ARPA-E, there's DOE money. As you pointed out earlier, there's not much, you know, corporations now are captive to the quarterly returns. They don't want to invest in experiments. So how do you maneuver between all of these different types of pots of money if someone has that good idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we need to be imaginative. I think that agencies like ARPA-E need to grow. I think that they need to see their budget expanded. I think that a larger segment of the community here needs to understand that this is a living organism, that they need to come to Washington and spend time as program directors. I think that all needs to grow. I am hopeful that Breakthrough is going to be able to be successful, and there will be other similar funds that are capable of going earlier. I think that experimenting with new mechanisms of funding, and in particular public-private partnerships, where you can have public sector actors pay down risk that enable private sector money to come in sooner. At the other end, I also think that we need to be working with other organizations, people that can put the really enormous amounts of money to work that are going to be necessary to deploy these things. It's all fine and well to say, all right, you know, we can cobble together 150 or 200 or 300 million dollars to get this over the finish line. Now I need $4 billion to deploy it. Who's going to do that, right? And again, as I've mentioned, that's going to have to be private equity. That's going to have to be pension funds. It's going to have to be sovereign wealth funds. And so how can you get those people into the game and ready for that next handoff at the other side? I think we have to work on looking at every single slice of this very large valley of death to build an ecosystem that gets people across it.
Right.
And there was a question concerning that on the Valley of the Death, which goes, and Arun, you had mentioned earlier about the Cimatech kind of.
Yeah, so let me just add to that. If you look at the climate issue, it's a gigaton scale problem. It's a massive. 1 gigaton is the total weight of all the people in this world. That's 1 gigaton. Okay, and we are emitting 40 gigatons per year. So if you want to do this at scale, you need industries that are already at the gigaton scale.
Yep.
And if you look at how many industries at the gigaton scale, you can count them on your fingertips. It's oil, gas, coal, steel, concrete, agriculture. That's it. And so of all those industries, and you ask the question, who has the big shareholder pressure that is trying to pushing them towards decarbonization, and who has the balance sheet to be able to invest? And you kind of very quickly come to the conclusion that oil and gas is there to be changed. And I think they are now willing to step up and be part of the investment community and be adopters of technology, and they're engineering companies. So I would really look at oil and gas, and you were, of course, part of one of the oil and gas majors.
They need to do more.
They need
Honestly,
to do more, but
otherwise it's kind of cute
That's
that
right.
we're.
Yeah, but I don't think demonizing them.
No, but I think it's
and I think we have to be
recognizing
careful of
the
that.
size of the problem, and so when and how do you take a risk-reward look from a corporate perspective, and the timing of that, right, needs to be really factored in, because they are big balance sheets. And so it's one thing if compared to my personal balance sheet, you say, wow, ARPA-E, is doing X, times that. But some of these big corporations, as they band together and they look at, could they collectively reduce risk by doing things together? I think that conversation needs to be accelerated versus every single group, even Breakthrough, having to parse it independently.
That's what ARPA-E could, or the government in general, Department of Energy, could do, is to be able to bring groups of companies that perhaps are along a supply chain to be able to be part of that ecosystem to do things like demonstration projects. Because if I would rather have the private sector, maybe with a little bit of money, it's like a Cimatech model, a little bit of money from the government, but mostly from the private sector, if they can do demonstration projects to de-risk something, it's much more bankable than the government trying to do those demonstration projects. Yeah. Because the history of the Department of Energy trying to do demonstration projects it's mixed. And so I think the private sector, and this is what ARPA-E could do, is potentially bring together consortia of companies that, and in a competitive way, and enhance and push these technologies along, hopefully with some help from Breakthrough and other entities like that, and with the large majors who have the balance sheet to be able to invest in that mix as well. And I think that could accelerate the progress of technology.
And moving up even deeper, I think there's real opportunities now to get companies who wouldn't ordinarily be on your list to look at their supply chains and drive change into the system. We've had a really recent exciting example where Apple Computer wants to decarbonize its supply chain, and it looked at aluminum as a bad carbon emitter, and they've actually funded a project to create a decarbonized aluminum fabrication plant. So public pressure, desire to be sustainable and to do the right thing is really going to start to make an impact. I'm not exactly sure how ARPA-E can tap into that, but I bet the clever people we have at ARPA-E can figure that out. And so that's another thing that has real optimism in my mind for the future.
Okay, we're going to have to close out, so I have a final questions for everyone. When Steve Chu first brought the ARPA-E team together, he gave you a simple mission: change the world.
Yeah.
And I suspect that 90% of the folks out here today are on that same mission.
Yeah.
They would like to, they'd like to be a part of changing the world.
Yeah.
So, what advice, and Arun will go down all the way, what is your advice to these folks that want to change the world? How can they go about it?
I would say that mission has been amplified now, given the world that we're living in. There are some huge opportunities, but the challenges are even more than what we had thought earlier in 2009. So I think this is the mission. If you want a mission, I think we can get Steve Chu to come and amplify that even more the next time we get together. But that mission is existing, it is there today, and it is even more urgent and important now than it was 10 years ago.
And Eric, how do they do that?
Our ARPA-E, like DARPA and the other ARPAs, is a very different kind of federal agency. ARPA-E is is a living organization that belongs to the entire community. It's not just about the people who are there today. The people who are there today are there to shepherd it and to act as caregivers. I think that it's important for the community to understand their responsibility to this overall organization, come to Washington, serve as a program director, be a part of this. And so the idea that this is a living organization that belongs to the whole community is my bit.
Be the change you want to see in this world.
There you go.
Yeah, I think people have to look for where can they personally step up, and it may be being a program director, a tech to market advisor, it may be mentoring teams in your local community, it may be the type of local policy that's being set at the state level as well. As we look at this particular point in time, state and more local policies really matter. But I would also, urge people to think about how and why in the work that you're doing. Many of you are funded by ARPA-E today. Is how do you invite more people in to help you think even bigger? Like beyond the project you have today, into that next step, how do you find out what's the problem to be solved to get this to the market? And find out what is that. So in concrete, Eric and I were talking beforehand, it's corrosion, not emission necessarily, right? So if you don't get to that problem, you're off base. And invite people who make you uncomfortable into your space to make you think bigger. And I think that would go a long way to really enabling this whole thing to move to a bigger place.
Yeah. And then I guess to cap it all off, my final comment is don't be afraid. It's so easy to get depressed because the problems are so big, the problems are so hard. But take a look at the changes that we've seen in the last 10 years. 10 years ago, we would never have believed we would be where we are today with the price of solar, with the price of batteries, with the integration of the grid. So many things are changing so fast. So when you see something that looks daunting today and you're afraid, don't be afraid. We can tackle these problems, and we've demonstrated at ARPA-E that you can make a change. And it's really worth taking that risk and making that effort.
Well, let me conclude with the thought that, Cheryl, you sort of put in my mind. When we were looking at structuring ARPA-E early on, we went to see Tony Tether at DARPA and said, what advice do you have?
Yeah.
And part of it was to have these short tenures so that there would be a sense of urgency.
Yeah.
The other thing that he said, that if he were to design a building for DARPA now, he would have one bathroom in the middle, and he would have a cafeteria right in the middle, so that everybody had to come together and collaborate.
Yeah.
And so I hope that the summit, to some extent, is that
bathroom?
That bathroom. So that people can use it as a vehicle to come together, to share ideas, to realize they don't have all the answers, and somebody else can give a different way to look at it. And so it's my congratulations to Shane and all the people that have put the summit together over these years for once again doing a great job. And thank all of you for joining us.
Yeah.
Great.